The capture of the Venezuelan president was the climax of months of a conflict full of fireworks. When traffickers' boats were destroyed, missiles fell on ports, and special operations were carried out to capture ships. But in the midst of all this, there was a plan. The CIA was in action, maps were drawn, and plans began to be made, which would culminate in the best of the American troops entering Venezuelan territory. This is a long video that will present you with the whole context of the conflict, but if you want to skip to the action, just click on the timestamps. The Venezuelan president, Nicolás Maduro, appeared in a photo alongside American Special Forces on January 13, 2026, after long months of tension and talks with the American Donald Trump. That seemed to be the conclusion of a long conflict between two countries that once had good relations during the second half of the 20th century. That relationship was mostly positive. The scenario changed in 1999 with the arrival of Hugo Chavez to the Venezuelan presidency. Years later, Chavez began to declare himself a socialist and anti-imperialist, adopting an openly oppositional stance toward the American government. Tensions intensified when Venezuela accused the United States of supporting the 2002 coup attempt, an allegation that was later partially revised. In 2008, Caracas expelled the American ambassador in support of Bolivia, deepening the diplomatic rift. Despite a brief improvement in 2009, relations deteriorated again. Hugo Chavez died in 2013, and Nicolás Maduro took power in 2014. He expelled United States diplomats under unproven accusations. The definitive break occurred in 2019 during the Venezuelan presidential crisis, when Nicolás Maduro's government broke off relations after the United States recognized Juan Guaidó as interim president. From then on, relations only got worse. Throughout the governments of Hugo Chavez and Nicolás Maduro, several foreign companies left Venezuela after expropriations during the crisis. The government president, so many eggs, Guya and Dalfish left possible points vacated in ratification, attempts in those, that of Romero, Foreign Affairs, Glutes, Reduction Jang. Did Ford suspend or drastically reduce its activities? But then the Venezuelans also touched on a point that was too sensitive for the Americans: the oil sector, which was also a central axis of the Venezuelan economy. In 2007, Chavez ordered that all projects in the Orinoco Belt would come under the majority control of the state-owned company Petróleos de Venezuela, Sociedad Anónima. Companies like ExxonMobil and ConocoPhillips refused the new terms and had their assets expropriated, starting long international disputes that resulted in billion-dollar compensations, including attempts to seize assets like Citgo. Chevron, on the other hand, agreed to become a minority partner and stayed in the country, currently maintaining a strategic role in negotiations between Caracas and Washington. Thanks to special licenses from the United States to continue operating in the oil sector, Maduro has stirred up controversies during his government. An independent United Nations fact-finding mission concluded that the Bolivarian National Guard was responsible over more than 10 years for serious human rights violations and crimes against humanity, especially the persecution of political opponents. Maduro's wife, Celia Flores, was one of the major forces behind his government, with political maneuvers and an iron fist that crushed opponents. She was a confidant of Hugo Chavez, and after becoming so important was accused of putting relatives in power and of knowing that her nephews were cocaine traffickers. Until January 3, 2026, there were other military operations attacking Venezuela. In 2020, still during Donald Trump's first term, a secret operation aimed at overthrowing the Venezuelan president, Nicolás Maduro, failed while still in the preparation stage. Operation Gideon planned for about 300 fighters trained in clandestine camps in Colombia to cross the border, attack military installations, and trigger a popular uprising that would culminate in the arrest of Maduro. It was led by former Venezuelan General Cliver Alcalá, with support from former United States Green Beret Jordan Goudreau, founder of a private security company. However, the plan proved unfeasible due to a lack of resources, poor training of the volunteers, and internal disputes among opposition groups. Under the darkness of the Caribbean, Operation Gideon took shape in May 2020 when two boats left the Venezuelan coast of Guajira heading toward Venezuela. Carrying Venezuelan deserters and former American military personnel, hoping to reach Caracas and cause a rupture in Nicolás Maduro's regime, the plan, however, began to fall apart as soon as they arrived. The first group was awaited in Macuto, where a brief, uneven clash sank the boat and killed its leader. Kalina, amid conflicting reports about who started the shooting. Meanwhile, public statements were announcing an incursion that, in practice, had already failed. The second boat, overloaded and with mechanical problems, lost equipment at sea and scattered its men along the coast before being intercepted by Venezuelan forces shortly afterward. Without offering resistance, what had been conceived as a bold incursion ended in an episode of disorganization and capture, with some killed and dozens arrested. As the investigation progressed, authorities in Colombia began to examine the role of those involved, especially after the seizure of weapons and the arrest of Alcalá on drug trafficking charges. No evidence of direct involvement by the United States emerged, although members of the opposition linked to Juan Guaidó were aware of the operation and considered it unrealistic. After the collapse of the operation, the fighters were left to fend for themselves. Meanwhile, the Venezuelan government claimed to have infiltrated the plan from within. It ended in disarray within the opposition. The FBI put a bounty on the heads of Jordan Goudreau and Alcalá. Operation Gideon failed. But years later, Trump would start a new conflict with Maduro. After Trump began his second term, he had a lot to work on. The promise to solve the war in Ukraine in one day was blocked by a Putin who manipulated him like a child. Then, Netanyahu, already involved in the Gaza war, brought Israel into a conflict with Iran. Only after this last part was resolved did Donald Trump turn his attention. For Maduro, the trigger was the Venezuelan electoral process in July 2024. Nicolás Maduro, seeking a third term, was declared the winner by the National Electoral Council, with 51.2% of the votes, despite substantial evidence and parallel counts by the opposition indicating a crushing defeat. The democratic international community, led by the United States and the European Union, refused to recognize the legitimacy of the election, labeling it as fraudulent. In January 2025, when Maduro took office, the White House officially declared the Venezuelan regime as illegitimate, closing all secondary channels of communication, which had maintained a minimum level of stability. The embassies were shut down and diplomatic status was reduced to zero. Maduro gave the Americans even more reasons by aggressively reactivating the territorial dispute between Venezuela and Guyana in the Essequibo region. In 2024 and 2025, Maduro intensified nationalist policies, holding referendums for the annexation of the oil-rich territory and mobilizing troops to the border. He messed with the oil once again. There was a massive presence of ExxonMobil and other corporations in the region. That was already enough, besides the fact that the United States no longer wanted the massive presence of China and Russia on a continent they considered their backyard. Of course, oil is not a pretty flag to fight for. None of the great powers simply announces that they are going to fight because of oil or minerals. Territory needs the excuse of a bunch of Nazis in the other government, an evil dictator, or a persecuted minority. That Maduro was not a good person, anyone in their right mind already knew, but the world is already full of bad dictators. Trump analyzed and thought about two other things that pleased him. The fight against narco-terrorism was treated as a security strategy that authorized the use of military force against transnational criminal organizations. In this context, the reclassification of the Venezuelan government as a drug cartel. It was used as a political and legal instrument to legitimize offensive military actions under the argument of confronting international organized crime. And there was something that was rarely talked about, but that fit well with Trump's policy. Direct control at the source was conceived as a policy of forced stabilization of countries that produce refugees. In this context, regime change was treated as a strategic tool to contain the migratory flow toward the southern border of the United States. Washington had raised the flags. Now it needed to put everything into operation. The government employed an aggressive lawfare strategy. The State Department designated the Aragua Train and the Soles Cartel, an alleged drug trafficking organization embedded in the Venezuelan military high command, as foreign terrorist organizations. The formal indictment of Nicolás Maduro and his inner circle for narco-terrorism. It allowed the United States to treat the conflict and not as a war between nations, which would require congressional authorization, but as a large-scale extraterritorial police operation. The reward for the capture of Maduro was raised to $50 million, clearly signaling the intention to decapitate the regime. Operation Sulfenspeer was officially launched in the second half of 2025, starting in August 2025. The United States Southern Command began a significant buildup of forces in the Caribbean, marked by the deployment of the United States ship Gerald R. Ford Carrier Strike Group to waters north of Venezuela. The composition of the fleet indicated offensive capabilities, in addition to drug interdiction, including air power with F-35 and F/A-18 fighters to overcome anti-air defenses. Amphibious assets, with United States ship Iwo Jima and United States ship San Antonio serving as forward bases, and Arleigh Burke-class destroyers capable of missile defense and land attacks with Tomahawk missiles. The missiles began flying shortly thereafter. Drones, such as the MQ-9 Predator, for example, carried Hellfire missiles in the skies over the Caribbean, waiting for the command when the target was found. The first of them was in September 2025. The Americans already knew about a drug trafficking route in the Caribbean, and they had assigned the Naval Special Warfare Development Group, also known as Sea, Air, and Land Team 6, to monitor the region. Originally a fishing village, San Juan del Nari had been transformed since 2018 into a logistics center for international drug and human trafficking. The Costa de Sucre region was used by the Aragua Train as a route for transporting drugs destined for the United States, passing through the Caribbean islands. 3 speedboats left the place, but one of them was detected at sea. The high speed was not faster than the Hellfire missile, which struck down on the vessel. The explosion incinerated most of the crew, but 2 of them survived. According to reports, Pete Hegseth, the United States Secretary of War, had verbally given Sea, Air, and Land Team 6 the directive to eliminate all targets. The 2 individuals who survived the initial impact were later killed in a subsequent confirmation attack known as a double tap. The airstrikes didn't stop there. The drones were flying, identifying targets wherever they could. The American armed forces had plenty of munitions to use against the drug traffickers, even though there were questions about the validity of the attacks, arresting them and using them to gather information. The gunfire continued. Speedboats were destroyed one after another, reaching a total of 36 vessels destroyed and 115 dead, until end of 2025. Not only Venezuelan cartels were affected, but also some Colombian ones. Fishermen reported charred body parts being carried by the sea to nearby beaches. After that, Trump's eyes turned elsewhere, to the clandestine oil tankers that were helping the Venezuelans circumvent the sanctions. Trump declared that he had given the CIA the green light to operate inside Venezuela again, but he tasked his agents with obtaining valuable information. The House of The next leap in the war was in 2025. The American helicopters left the United States ship Gerald R. Ford and flew over the waters of the Caribbean, carrying 10 United States Marine Corps personnel and several Special Forces soldiers. The target was the oil tanker Skipper. As they approached the ship, the helicopters began a meticulously planned operation, the result of an investigation that had already linked the vessel to a clandestine network for smuggling Venezuelan and Iranian oil, whose resources funded structures associated with terrorism. The operation generated immediate reactions with accusations of piracy from the Venezuelan government. Investigations indicated that the Skipper, operating since 2005, deliberately manipulated transponder signals to hide his real position, and he sailed under the Guyanese flag without any valid registration. In light of this evidence, the United States Department of the Treasury imposed sanctions on the vessel, accusing it of being part of an oil smuggling scheme intended to finance the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps and Hezbollah. On December 20th, the United States Coast Guard boarded a second vessel, the oil tanker Centaurus. Was carrying about 1.8 million barrels of oil off the coast of Venezuela, according to an unidentified source. The boarding was considered unjustified due to the vessel's history of transporting oil to China and the application of the so-called right of visit, a maritime law provision that authorizes warships to inspect vessels suspected of illicit activities. The authorization for the inspection was granted by Panama. He stated that the Centaurus had violated Panamanian maritime law by turning off its transponder while sailing loaded with oil, a recurring practice of the ship, which had already been linked to the deliberate falsification of its position until December 2025. The United States Coast Guard had been pursuing the very large crude carrier Bella 1 across the Atlantic for 10 days. An oil tanker already linked to the transport of Iranian oil and heading to load was going to load Venezuelan oil connected to a recently sanctioned Panamanian businessman. The vessel was subject to United States sanctions for allegedly operating on the black market for the benefit of Hezbollah and the Houthis, as well as maintaining ties with the Houthis. It has a history of falsifying its position, lacking a valid flag, and refusing to be boarded. On December 20th, the ship resisted inspection and changed course, with the pursuit continuing at the end of the month. The painting of a Russian flag and the subsequent registration under a new name further complicated any attempts at seizure by raising legal disputes with Russia under international maritime law. After that, there was a new escalation with the first ground attack in Venezuela. A CIA drone launched missiles at a port facility inside Venezuelan territory at the end of December 2025. The attack destroyed what United States intelligence claimed was a logistics center for drug trafficking. The attack served as a final warning and a demonstration of the United States' ability to strike targets inside the country with impunity. During the period of these events, some rather insane videos surfaced in Venezuela. First, Maduro made his appearances dancing despite the threat to his country, probably to calm the population. Meanwhile, rifles were being distributed and a militia of millions was promoted as a resistance force against the Americans. Weapons were displayed and even fighter jets flew to demonstrate power. A Venezuelan F-16 flew over the American ship's air defense system. They were in the streets. Afterwards, Maduro drove through the Venezuelan streets, talking about various topics, such as the war, and even commented on a possible negotiation with Trump. Meanwhile, several conversations took place. Sources reported that the Venezuelan president had conditioned his departure from power on an agreement with Trump. He demanded to keep $200 million in assets, amnesty for his allies, and safe asylum. Would amnesty affect the negotiation? The 15-minute conversation stalled mainly over the demand for broad amnesty and disagreements about the transitional government and the fate of exile. Trump suggested China or Russia, while Nicolás Maduro preferred to stay in the Western Hemisphere, citing Cuba. Qatar later emerged as an intermediate alternative. None of that worked out. There were talks about support from Russia and China for Venezuela, but not much was seen at that time. Newspapers even reported that an Ilyushin Il-76 transport plane linked to Wagner Group mercenaries landed in Caracas in the second half of 2025. Others talked about the sale of Russian air defense systems, some of which were shown by Maduro throughout the year. But the fact was that Russia was more likely to use the planes to take dictators to its territory, as it did with Assad in Syria, rather than getting into a war on another continent. Africa, the Middle East, and Ukraine were already a lot, and Syria, Nagorno-Karabakh, and the problems with jihadists in the Sahel made that very clear. China, on the other hand, didn't have much tendency to get involved in these wars. Its methods of taking over a country were financial. While Maduro was meeting with a Chinese representative, the Americans were finalizing preparations for the climax of months of threats and ineffective maneuvers against the regime. Operation Absolute Resolve was about to be launched. For months, the United States Armed Forces had been openly increasing their presence on the Venezuelan coast, carrying out operations that included neutralizing vessels suspected of drug trafficking. However, there was much more going on behind all this commotion. At the same time, United States intelligence agencies scrutinized the life of President Nicolás Maduro, mapping everything from his daily habits to his most intimate routines. While special forces were secretly training for a forced extraction plan, the CIA had already recruited a member of the Venezuelan leader's inner circle in August 2025. It was through him that crucial information was obtained. The preparation included exhaustive exercises. In a replica of the presidential complex, Delta Force, the elite unit of American troops, built an exact copy of Maduro's residence, where they rehearsed every detail of the incursion. In addition, the use of heavy equipment was planned, described by Donald Trump as high-powered blowtorches, capable of breaking through the steel walls of a safe room, capable of breaking through a safe room. At the beginning of December, the units involved considered themselves fully capable, knowing precisely the movements and even the details of the Venezuelan leader's life. Maduro had gone to sleep after the meeting with the Chinese representative. When the time for the attack became right, the weather was good. The signal was given for the helicopters to take off while the troops were boarding at the airports at 1:30 in the morning on January 3, 2026. The offensive began with United States cyber and electronic warfare assets, launching massive interference on Venezuelan air defense radars and communications, effectively blinding the S-300 VM systems. Most of the lights in the capital went out, leaving many in darkness, which would soon be lit up by the American attacks. The missiles found the air defense systems in Caracas, shutting them down. Civilians ran in panic, illuminated by the destruction of the military equipment. The mausoleum of Hugo Chavez burned in flames, symbolizing what was to come and the wrath of the Americans against everything that represented the government of Maduro and his predecessor. The missiles were falling, bombs were canceling any opportunity for defense. Whatever Maduro's allies had sent to stop American air power, it wasn't working. 20 minutes after the electronic interference, explosions echoed at every strategic point in Caracas. Precision missiles and drone strikes hit communication and defense nodes. In La Guaira and in the state of Miranda, the bombings continued. At 2 in the morning, missiles surgically struck the Ministry of Defense and the La Carlota Air Base in the heart of the capital. The objective was to prevent the Venezuelan Air Force from taking off and to decapitate the military command. The targets burned, and whatever ammunition was in those facilities or places also exploded. People watched the fires in specific parts of the city and started communicating, knowing who was attacking, but without understanding if war had really broken out and what the real target was. 15 minutes later, MH-47 Chinook and MH-60 Black Hawk helicopters from the 100th Special Operations Aviation Regiment were spotted. Luhansk flying low over Caracas, flying under fire and explosions. Undisturbed, air defense systems went silent or were silenced. Not even portable air defense systems appeared to attack the aircraft at that altitude. Maduro had said in October of the previous year that he had acquired 5,000 systems. 9K-38 Igla, a Russian portable missile launcher weapon capable of hitting targets. Until now, there was only one image of what could have been one of these shots. But given the altitude at which the helicopters were flying, it could also have been a shot from those aircraft. The presence of these helicopters flying so low was not a coincidence. They were the elite of the Night Stalkers, a force specialized in aerial support for secret missions, like those of Delta Force. Such operations were usually carried out under the cover of night, with high-speed movements at very low altitude. The flight went by without any significant incidents. Some of them fired their missiles, destroying what was left standing of the Venezuelan defenses. F-35C fighters and electronic warfare aircraft, such as the EA-18G Growlers, suppressed the threat from Russian missile systems, ensuring the safe operation of the helicopters. In the contested airspace over Caracas, there were about 150 aircraft flying over Venezuela and the surrounding territory. None of the fighters from the country under attack managed to take off. A Chinook is said to have carried the Delta Force operators. The soldiers began the attack on the main target at 2:15 in the morning. Maduro was caught by surprise. While explosions thundered throughout the city, the Delta agents advanced through the corridors of the presidential residence, familiar with every corner. Weapons targeted anyone interfering on the grounds, but resistance was quickly neutralized by gunfire and the swift attack. Speed, violence of action, and surprise were the key words in any assault like this. Maduro was captured along with his wife before he could reach the safe room. At 2:45 p.m., the special forces were already taking the Venezuelan president and his wife, Celia Flores, to the helicopters. The aircraft flew over the columns of smoke in Caracas, taking the targets to their destination. The return trip was smooth until they reached the United States ship Iwo Jima, where they disembarked to later be transported to the United States and put on trial. At 4:21 a.m., President Donald Trump announced on the Truth Social platform that the United States had carried out a large-scale attack, resulting in the capture of Maduro. The reactions varied. The mobilization of the Venezuelan troops when it happened was late and ineffective. The Americans had already left the territory. The Venezuelan commanders would have to deal with losses such as the Buk M2 air defense system, which was hit and destroyed by the United States at Igorote Airport. The Americans left behind about 40 dead, both civilians and military, and signs of explosions. And Venezuela still surprised by how quickly they lost a president they couldn't remove for so many years. There were demonstrations of support for the attack, both in Venezuela and abroad. Venezuelan immigrants celebrated the fall of the regime, while the local population showed ambivalent reactions. In the political sphere, many expressed support for the deposed president, a predictable attitude given the dynamics of local power. The streets of Caracas woke up silent without major unrest under a tense atmosphere, while other countries made their usual selective remarks about the invasion of a sovereign nation. Constitutionally, Article 233 of the Venezuelan Constitution established that, in the absolute absence of the president, the executive vice president would assume the position, which would make Delcy Rodriguez the interim president. Delcy Rodriguez became interim president and announced the calling of elections within 30 days, stating that the elected president would serve a full 6-year term. If Maduro's supporters lost strength, there would be room for the opposition, whose most likely candidate was Edmundo González Urrutia, the candidate in the 2024 elections. A longtime academic and diplomat, González was exiled in Spain. In a press conference, Donald Trump stated that a team made up of civilian and military advisors, including Pete Hegseth and the Secretary General Marco Rubio, would begin working directly with the Venezuelan population. The president did not rule out the presence of American troops in the country and stated that United States forces had already operated on Venezuelan soil, and he maintained that Washington would assume the provisional administration of Venezuela until a new leadership was chosen, justifying the action as necessary given the high risk and seriousness of the operation. When asked about other countries like Russia and China interested in oil, he said that the United States was good at negotiating oil. And of course, as a Venezuelan said in an interview, Russians and Chinese were not in Venezuela to learn about traditional food recipes.
What do they think the Russians and the Chinese wanted for so long? The recipe for arepa? Impossible.
The plane that brought Maduro to the United States landed in New York hours later. FBI agents went to get Maduro inside the aircraft and dozens of them escorted him through the airport, so proceedings for his United States trial could begin. Then, Maduro was led through the corridors of the DEI headquarters in New York, at which point, in an unusual gesture, he wished the agents a Happy New Year. After that, he and his wife would be taken to the detention center, where they would await trial on charges of drug trafficking and other crimes. Thus, another chapter in the strange paths of geopolitics ended. The United States, so criticized in 2025 due to its declining economy, made a show of power in what they claimed was their sphere of influence. Much would be said about the subject, whether Maduro had left willingly in the end, and because of that, there had been so few casualties. And no effective air defense system, they believe, no portable system worked that night. Could the Venezuelan armed forces really be so pathetic as to offer even less resistance than less prepared armies have shown against the United States? Was that one of the last gasps of the declining American empire? What would be the fate of Venezuela? There were many questions and conspiracy theories from both sides, issues that only time might answer, but it wasn't wise to expect a pleasant response. The next chapter in history could be recorded with the hypocritical diplomacy of nations or with the explosive sincerity of missiles.